Hello, and welcome to Tech Connects, Dice's podcast where we dig into topics on tech hiring, recruiting, and careers that matter to you. I'm your host, Nick Kolakowski. I'm going to talk to great guests every month about the current state of the tech careers world, including taking the temperature of the tech job market, the hottest tech skills, what companies are doing to attract and retain technology professionals in a historically tight market, and much more. Our next guest is Jeff Spector, who's co-founder and president of Karat, a cloud-based platform for technical interviewing. Karat conducts technical interviews on behalf of companies, making sure to align the interview process with the client's needs. It's designed to help companies rapidly scale their technical interviewing and, ultimately, their hiring. I wanted to talk to Jeff because Karat recently released its latest hiring trends report, which offers a ton of insight into how tech leaders are approaching hiring right now. What are companies using to source their candidates, and how are they valuing the engineers that they bring aboard? Let's jump into the discussion. So thank you for being on and for taking the time. Obviously, Karat is an interviewing platform aimed at technologists and others in the space. And so I am deeply interested in talking to you because, tech is what we do and all the insights that you can give into the hiring and interviewing market and so on, I think would be of a really great utility to our listeners. So thank you for being on.
Yeah, great. Glad to be here.
Great. Karat is releasing a hiring trend report. And one of the things that sort of jumped out at me as I was going through it was that based on the data that you accrued from these tech leaders that you interviewed, the tech leaders were discussing how certain top performers deliver 3, 4, 5 times the value of the total compensation to an organization. And that jumped out at me because for years we've had this myth of maybe it's not a myth, of the 10X developer, the developer who is so extraordinary, they're doing the work of 10 other developers, they're plowing through, they're amazing, they can change a startup into a giant tech corporation seemingly overnight. But it also made me wonder, like when we talk about the value that's brought in by developers and how leaders perceive that value and the multiples of that value, I mean, how does an organization actually determine that? Like what differentiates them from performers who might deliver, say, just 1X value or 2X value or something like that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about the 10X engineer, that's not, I don't think people are actually using that as an accurate multiple of, how much value they're bringing the organization. I think it's kind of a term used to describe someone who's adding outsized value relative to maybe their peers or to the market. And I don't think there's actually companies are trying to measure engineering effectiveness and things, but I don't think they're accurately trying to measure down to like individual engineers what's the multiple of like their salary or something, right? So I think it's just kind of an indicator of that this person adds a lot of value. And when in our work and when we've been talking to engineering leaders, generally what we've seen them talk about the types of employees that add significant value are a couple of things. So one would be like individual contributors who can solve very difficult tasks, right? They have some combination of ability plus maybe like a deep understanding of a specific space that they can go really deep into, and someone will turn to them and say, hey, I can't solve this problem. You're an expert here. Can you help me break through on this problem? So that's one type. I think the second type are, managers or team leads who make their teams more effective by better communication through collaboration. Maybe they help people keep focused. They can set architecture and the vision and things. And so it's basically ensuring that everyone else on their team is incredibly productive. And then I think the third one is just people who are more productive, right? You have people who actually can just produce more high quality code and do it better than others. And so, those ones will just produce more than their peers. I think it's interesting to think about the 10X developer because I think relying on individual like acts of heroism is not a sustainable strategy of like, hey, I have this one person, can they continually hit home runs? Yeah. And what we saw in our report, which was interesting, is that you may be better off with like a team of 3 to 4X folks that are really good. And what we found is that the highest performing and like the most confident engineering leaders, the ones who felt like their team were performing the best, they put a much higher multiple on their average engineer than the other teams. So it kind of to us spelled, ensuring that you have a very high quality hiring process, that, you don't have any low performers that get into the team, because it's a really huge morale hit when you are looking around and you're maybe the only one or one of a very few top performers, and, somebody else who's there slacking off or just not creating the same, near the value you are is really demoralizing and probably will cause you to leave over time.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of what Steve Jobs said, where you have to continually keep hiring A players, because as soon as you start hiring B players, then there's sort of this. He saw it as sort of this collapse, where then all of a sudden you had C players and D players, and maybe he was a little harsh on that, but I mean there is sort of maybe as you said, something to be said for sort of wanting to like kind of maintain standards and keep them high.
Yeah, I think there's a multiplier effect, right? Like that it's when you have more and more people and you see everybody else performing really well, you're going to want to continue to perform. It's kind of what you're talking about is kind of the reverse of the, if you just get 1% better a day within like a year, you're going to be 10 times better at whatever the task you're doing. I do think that there is a, when you kind of let someone into the barn, that isn't really performing well, it does have a really negative impact on their work and the productivity there, but also everyone else that they work with.
Given that it's sort of intense need for talent and all of those pressures and everything else, the other thing that jumped out at me in your report that sort of aligned with that was the weakening in the use of sourcing agencies and referrals, and that really jumped out at me because a lot of the tech companies that I speak with are very intense about like they're using their sourcing companies and their referrals and so on. Like they'll cling to it in an uncertain world, and that's how they sort of pipeline their talent. So I mean, given you think that it just seemed almost counterintuitive to me. You think that, especially given the turbulence in the market, they rely on it more, but you're seeing less. I mean, what do you think is behind that? It was extraordinary to me.
Yeah, I think a couple things. So, and they're different maybe between the sourcing agencies and the referrals. So let me tackle them separately. Okay. The sourcing agency, I think, as companies are just hiring less, and that volume is shifting towards like larger, more stable enterprises. They tend to have large recruiting teams that can do the searches, and they rely less on sourcing agencies. It actually isn't really economical for them. They're usually leaning on sourcing agencies for niche roles, not like their standard roles. Whereas if you get into startups or smaller enterprises that were getting a lot of funding in tech, they lean pretty heavily on sourcing agencies because they maybe don't have the team in place. And these larger enterprises also, if they are hiring less, and they want to make sure that their teams are fully utilized before they go to an outside firm, right? So now, when things pick back up, you are seeing, because there were a decent amount of layoffs of tech recruiters, that I could see maybe sourcing agencies will pick back up if there's, when the recovery happens, but also I bet contract recruiting firms are going to pick back up, because I know a lot of the people we talk to, a lot of the TA leaders are trying to figure out like, how do I get away from this boom and bust cycle where I hire up a bunch of people on my team and then I, have to inevitably go through what is a really tough time in laying people off. And so I think they'll be more leveraged in the future than they have been. But memories are also short. So who knows how long they're going to remember this, 2 years from now. I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah. So for the referrals, this is actually a trend we've seen for several years where people are moving more away from referrals. I think one is driven by the need to build inclusive teams. And obviously there's a lot of research out there of like, if you just hire the people and your team's not diverse to start with, it's going to be hard to continue to make headway against the diversity goals doing that. I think also because non-tech companies are doing more of the hiring now, and they're a larger percentage of the hiring, they are actually looking for people outside of their networks. They're, for the first time ever, like if you think about, let's just take a sector, financial services. A lot of people from financial services move around, between banks and insurance companies because there's a knowledge they have of the business side of things. And so you do get a huge amount of referrals in there. But now for the first time ever, they're looking at, wow, I can get talent from the tech companies that I never had before, but I don't have networks, as many networks into the tech companies. And so I think they're relying on referrals less. And because, there's more talent on the market, so there's more people directly applying. And so then they can actually, if they have systems in place to screen in some of the best talent that is applying directly, they can get more hires that way as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you see a lot of movement in-house? I mean, the one thing that I've been I can't really nail any numbers to it, but just sort of as in the course of my travels and talking to startups and so on, it seems that even companies that don't have necessarily a lot of resources to spin up, HR and intake and things like that are at least considering kind of doing a lot of stuff in-house and trying to kind of bringing it more closely in. I mean, are you seeing that as well, or is that something? Am I off base on that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think whenever there's a heavy focus on costs, right? People are going to try and do more with the resources that they have. And, sourcing agencies are not cheap, right? The average sourcing agency's 20 to 30% of first year salary, something like that. And if you're, it makes sense maybe if you're hiring like a senior role where it really matters, have networks there and they have a real expertise in that. I think for the standard roles or ones that you're going to be hiring more of, right, it's even more critical for you to develop the expertise to go learn how to do that and build that over time. And so then they just flex in, people who they want to lean in to grow in their own careers and kind of are taking a bet there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of sourcing, I mean, the other thing that really jumped out at me, just because over the past few years, I've written a lot about visas and things like that, and outsourcing and near sourcing, all these trends is the report cited a strong hiring trend for developers in India, including multinational companies opening development hubs in the country. And it struck me because at the same time I was reading your hiring report, I was also reading this other report, and I was talking to a few other developers who were talking about how the advent of ChatGPT and these other chatbots and their increased ability to generate low-level code, debug, et cetera, and things like that would potentially eliminate kind of a lot of these trends with regard to outsourcing and relying on India and things like that. So it seems like, I mean, there's almost two sort of ideas that are kind of almost colliding together. I wonder what your thoughts were on that, because it just seems like two massive trends that seems about to kind of just go head to head almost.
Well, I think the trend that we're seeing in India. So pretty much every client that we work with, every large enterprise that we work with right now, is either opening up something, scaling up their India work, or thinking about India or another kind of geography outside the U.S. In terms of doing their engineering work. And I think for India specifically, I think it's less about outsourcing anymore, and the entry level engineers, and much more that India is becoming or is a center of excellence for engineering. And so, we're seeing we did a report where we listed like the top cities by performance on our interviews. And India had 6 of the top 20, right? Hyderabad was leading the list. And it was kind of right in between like London and Washington, DC. So, I think it's less about hiring like low cost engineers, but they're moving over there because they're seeing it as like a massive market of available engineers that they can source that are higher quality. There's still obviously some outsourcing and things that are going on, but the shift that we're seeing is that multinational corporations are setting up like dev shops there as part of their global talent strategies versus a cost play. So I think that's the first thing on the Indian, maybe why we're seeing a bigger uptick. And then I think to your second point of like the fear around AI and generative AI. I feel like there's a future where it doesn't remove the need for entry level or those types of programmers. It just maybe relieves some of the cognitive burden of translating like those human ideas into code. And then it's the same. It's not really like a new phenomenon. We've seen developers consult tools for a while in terms of like Stack Overflow or Google or anything like that. It's just obviously much more magnified and a lot faster. But it's probably just going to change the nature of those jobs and not replace them, right? The demand for software engineers is going to keep growing and outpace the supply. And so what that means is that some of those firms in India or other places are probably going to have to adapt, and some of those engineers are going to have to adapt and learn different skills like prompt engineering and other things. But I don't see that they're going to go away. I think they're probably just going to have to adapt.
Yeah. Do you see, I mean, it does at Karat, are you seeing, I mean, there's also a lot of chatter among recruiters and hiring managers and so on about AI and chatbots and so on impacting the interview process and the hiring process in all sorts of different ways. I mean, are you seeing any sort of impact from that yet, or is it mostly conjecture? I mean, how are you viewing that aspect of the market?
I think there's certain companies are shying away from it altogether because there's actually new regulations and laws. Like people are afraid that AI is going to introduce a lot of bias in the hiring process and scale that up. And so there's some companies that are kind of like, until this thing all sorts out, I want to steer clear of that and make sure there's like human beings making decisions, making sure human beings are the ones doing this, and I can understand every part of my hiring process, and I can understand why they're doing that. The ones who are where we're seeing ones who are thinking about AI and hiring, a lot of what they're asking for is like, how do I ensure that I'm actually getting a great candidate, and it's not, there's no, I'm not just hiring ChatGPT, right? And so I think that's where, when we think about, for example, our interviews and how we do it, it's much more about problem solving. Can you explain things to me? That's why we have human beings. We have interview engineers who are there, and honestly, we don't really care if you use ChatGPT just like you'd use Stack Overflow in an interview. If that's what you're going to do on the job, that's what we should lean into that. What we really care about is then, can you explain what's going on? Can you help? I'm going to throw another wrench in this problem, and can you actually think through, why is this solution better than that solution? Some of our questions are, here's 3 or 4 solutions. Which one's the best? That's a hard thing for a ChatGPT to solve. So, I think that's where we're really seeing. There's obviously like other parts of the recruiting process where how do we use AI to kind of source more efficiently and things like that. But at least in the interviewing part of the process, that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
Do you think, AI gets cited as a future challenge in terms of, things that tech leaders worry about the future? What else, and it's sort of been dominating the conversation in this broad-based sort of way. What other kind of challenges or fears do tech leaders have kind of coming up? In terms of sourcing talent, in terms of everything that's sort of going to play out over the next, 5 years or so, anything like that? Again, because AI seems to dominate things. I'm interested in what else is also sort of top of mind for them.
Yeah, I think the main concern right now is what you kind of talked about, is that the industry is in a bit of upheaval, right? And there's just uncertainty everywhere. And so the landscape has just changed pretty dramatically over the last year. We had 200,000 people that found themselves in a job market. Like, we hadn't really seen something like that happen since the early 2000s, right? To your point, nobody really understands how AI is going to impact everything. I think they're all, there's a lot of prognostications about what this will be, but I don't know if anybody really knows exactly how much impact and how fast that impact is going to happen. And then people are cutting back expenses right now, and so they're worried about how do I handle the amount of work I have to do without being able to hire. We see a lot of things I can only hire contractors, but I can't hire FTEs because I'm a public company, right? Just things that are influencing decision making. And I do think that AI has shaken up the world. It's kind of, I think one of my colleagues says it's shaken the snow globe, right? And everybody's kind of waiting for that to sort out. And there's just a lot of uncertainty. But I don't think we're in a world where engineers are not going to matter in the future. And so if I were giving advice to tech leaders, I'd probably say, and invest and explore about what's going on, but don't panic. There's going to be a lot that changes. But we saw in this report, there are certain things. We've been doing this report for about 4 years. And there are definitely things that stay the same report to report, which is, you're still going to need great talent. You're still going to need a mission that motivates people. You're going to have to provide clarity and direction. The hiring processes, that people that have the highest investment in their hiring processes are the ones who actually are able to make, more hires. The ones who are building the most standardized and inclusive hiring processes are the ones who end up with the best teams. Things like that. Those things I don't think are going to change. So it's really just about being thoughtful, but not panicking.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. The other thing, it seems like a lot of the organizations that we talk to, among engineering leaders, CIOs, CEOs, et cetera, a really strong culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And one of the things that was interesting in your report was how it seemed like tech leaders were citing that, they had strong DEIB culture and resources in place for that. And it was interesting to me just because we've been running these diversity surveys of our own on our side involving tech professionals. And, 25% of the people we're surveying are saying in general that about 15% are saying the resources are definitely there and they seem to be in alignment with what leadership is saying. But then there's a significant percentage who are also saying that they're not necessarily sure their organizations are devoting the resources and attention necessary to making workplaces equitable. So, and it sort of jumped out at me reading your report. Do you think that there's potentially a gap between what leaders are perceiving and what tech professionals under them are experiencing? It just seemed interesting, and it's such an important issue right now. I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there is. I completely agree with what you're finding. We actually saw that in our study as well, which is there is a gap between how leadership views how they're doing on DEI initiatives and their employees. Actually, we saw CEOs thought they were doing the best, and then as you get farther away from the CEO, it gets worse and worse, right? And so I think there's probably a couple things. One, at least from our report, it could be that our report was focused mostly on hiring, and that there could be a ball being dropped on like inclusion and things that happen after you get hired, right? That maybe they're actually doing a good job in the hiring process, and then once somebody actually gets there, right, then there's like a sense of belonging and all the other issues of like how do I fit in, and how am I welcomed, and can I be my true self when I get to work, right? And so there is a chance that that's what's happening where we're seeing some of that. But given that you're also seeing that in your survey, I'd probably say it's more across the board that we're having this issue. And I think for us, like, for DEI initiatives to be successful, it's not enough. It definitely needs C-level buy-in, but that's not enough, right? Like, we need them to be on board, but that's where the work starts, not stops, right? And so, the C level may say, "Hey, great! Like, I'm out there, I'm declaring it. This is what's going on." And then, actually, like, when they go to implement, like, DEI is something that is not a single fish. It's not a silver bullet. There's no single thing you can do to really solve this. It's like 1,000 things that you have to do, and you have to do them really well. Here's an example: is that we actually worked with a large retailer, and who is hiring up a tremendous amount of engineers. And what we saw is that even though they had a lot of DEI initiatives and they were really focused on it, and we genuinely felt like they were doing a really good job, like they were trying their best to do this, we could see, for example, that candidates who we interviewed who did really well on our assessment, like men and women, were passed on to the next round at the same rates. Candidates who did not do well on our assessment, they were not passed through at the same rates. Like, they kind of were eliminated at the same rates, right? But candidates who were right on the bar of where their technical bar was, we were seeing men were being passed through at twice the rate of women, right? And it's something that, honestly, because our system allows you to tease this out and get, we're really standardized and we could catch this, right? Then we were able to make progress, and within a quarter, we were able to kind of eliminate that gap and close it to zero, right? But what if you don't have as standardized, or you don't have as like numerical process or something? What an employee might see is just that they're hiring more men than women, and they don't know why, even though that's going on. So what we drilled in there was like, who's making that decision? How are they making that decision, right? Like, let's really specifically go and attack that one part of the process that we can get more systems across. So I think, like, for DEI, you have to be vigilant, and you also have data, and you have to really like think through each time you're going to try and do this to actually have impact, or else you just fall down along the way somewhere.
Yeah, I imagine it can also mold the interview process, the beginning parts of the process, in a way to hopefully eliminate bias and things like that. But it would also sort of depend on an organization kind of taking a hard look at its interview process and sort of examining itself for that bias. And I imagine everyone wants to do that, obviously, but on a tactical level, it's probably really intense and difficult to make that happen. Just that self-awareness.
Yeah, and we are out there constantly advocating for the things that we've learned. To your point, like, not every organization has 1,000 interview engineers, like, where they're watching in their performance at all times and understanding what's going on and doing tens of thousands of interviews a month that they can learn from. And so there are definitely things that we've learned that we try and espouse to the industry. So, for example, and not every organization can do them, but we know that they work, right? Like, so one would be, for example, interviewing 24/7. So we interview whenever the candidate can meet. And we see that women of color especially interview outside of 9 to 5 hours, right? So if you want to be inclusive, you got to meet people where and when they want to interview. Our interview engineers don't look at resumes before they go into an interview, right? And if you're just doing a technical assessment, why do I need to inform you that this person worked at Google or Amazon or any other company that then, there's no reason, there's nothing that's happening in the interview that unless you're doing like a resume review and you're really digging into their background, that you need to know that. And so then there's, one, you don't have pedigree bias, and you don't have kind of like that in your head, but also it's not like, oh, I worked there too, right? And now I have likability bias. We tell every company to offer a redo interview. So we offer every candidate that comes through an opportunity to interview with us again if they feel like the first performance wasn't up to their best self. They didn't do as well as they could have. And so we offer it with a different interviewer and a different set of questions, but the same competencies, right? And what we found is that underrepresented talent takes us up at 30% higher rates on the redo. And we've just crossed the like 1,500 hire mark. So those are like 1,500 people that have gotten hired that if it was just their first performance, they would have actually been rejected. So we're both eliminating a false negative, and you're just putting candidates at ease, right? Because if I know I have an opportunity to take another interview, then I will like be less nervous and less stressed in the initial interview. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in your interviewing process to kind of work and help with both inclusion, diversity, but also just a better candidate experience.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I mean, the redo thing sounds like an amazing thing, just because, I mean, there are so many people who would naturally want to do a redo, and like, I mean, not everybody is feeling necessarily 100% on during their interview period. So yeah, no, that's amazing. Cool.
Yeah, and it came from a candidate, right? The redo actually started because a candidate, like year one of Karat, wrote to us and said, "Oh, I really botched that. I know I can do better. Can I have another shot?" And we kind of had a discussion internally, and we're like, "Yeah, why would we not? It's a lot easier to mess up when you're capable of doing something than to ace something that you have no idea what you're doing, right?"
Yeah.
And so we always tell our clients, like, you got to look at their best performance, because anybody can have a bad day. Maybe they just, you never know what's going on with someone's life, or maybe it's just the wrong question. They didn't hear it well, right? I mean, even in this interview, it's like, there's probably questions that you've asked that I totally, fully understood 100%. There's other ones that are like, wait, what are you asking me? And I'm trying to figure it out in real time, right? And therefore, I'm going to hopefully answer, hopefully I'll answer them all well, but who knows?
No, you answered them all well. No, that's perfect. Yeah, no, thank you. That was. I mean, every answer's been. Don't worry, you passed completely.
Great. I know.
It's always interesting to take a top-level view of the tech industry, particularly the hiring aspect of it. Here are some quick takeaways from the discussion with Jeff. First, when companies talk about employees who add significant value, they're often referring to those who can solve very difficult tasks using their combination of skills and experience. These valuable employees often have a very deep understanding of a specific space. But there are also employees who are very good team members, who use their soft skills to make those around them more effective. When you're hiring, you can adjust your hiring process to try to find employees who have some combination of all these abilities. Second, some companies are moving away from referrals as a way to source talent. This can open the door to companies creating more inclusive teams, because they're drawing talent from all sorts of places. While steering away from referrals might mean it takes longer to make a hire, it could also result in stronger teams. Third, even though there's a lot of chatter right now about how AI will impact the hiring process, it's intensely important that human beings remain in the hiring loop. While AI could run a coding challenge or evaluate a technical answer to a question, you ultimately need human recruiters and hiring managers to figure out whether a candidate will fit in with the team, for example, or possess the ability to talk through concepts in an easy-to-understand way. And that's it, folks. Thanks for listening in. We covered a whole lot of other topics during the episode, of course, so give it a re-listen if there was something you missed. We'll see you next time, and remember, Dice is your best resource to find the tech talent you need to fill your open roles, and, for tech pros, the best place to grow your tech career.